You know what they say, everything must come to an end, and so did the 20s. They had to come to an end, and they came to an end, abrupt halt. They stopped in the form of the crash of the stock market of 1929, and we are going to look at that. It is really just known as the Great Depression. So you can see the election of 1928. It says the election of 1928 was 1 year prior to the economic collapse. However, during this election, the candidates for the presidency spoke of a rosy future. So if you can imagine that, we had Herbert Hoover against Al Smith. Those were the candidates. You could see Hoover was the Republican, and you can see that he pretty much won by a landslide, and Al Smith there only received 87 of the electoral votes. The issues in the campaign during the presidential race, both candidates had issues that were positive and negative toward their campaign. Herbert Hoover was disliked in the sense that he favored prohibition, but he was a Quaker, so many people liked him. And sadly, Al Smith, they just didn't like him because he was Catholic. I don't think that would be an issue in this particular day and age with politics. Now, what we had during the 20s is what we call a bull market. It was a time shortly after Hoover was elected to office where stock prices continuously skyrocketed. So bull market is when there is a constant rise of stock prices. If you invest at $1 per share, then it goes up to $100 per share. You have made $99. They say that about Apple stock. If you had invested in Apple stock in the 1980s, you'd be very rich right now. With stocks rising, many Americans bought stock, but they bought it on credit, so they don't really have the money. So if you can imagine, that's why they tell you even this day and age credit is bad. The bear market is when you invest $100 and it goes to $1. I have had this happen myself. I've lost quite a bit of money in the stock market in the crash of 2008. Let's see, by 1929, 3 of 4 million Americans lost 10% of their household owned stock. Sorry about that. It was one of the causes of the crash because so many people had invested this way. So the crash happens. It's October 1929. You can see the causes to the left. Overproduction and low demand leads to employee layoffs. Low wages reduce consumer buying. High tariffs, which are taxes, restricted foreign demand of American goods. You don't want our stuff to be taxed because then other people are not going to want to buy it. Employment reduces buying further. You see the cyclical effect in that picture up above, and you see the stock prices, and then below you see how the stock market helps trigger the depression. So millions of people who had bought stock on the margin were notified that they owed their brokers money. On the margin means like on credit. By mid-November, some $30 billion was lost. The stock market, a place in New York City where shares or pieces of companies are bought and sold. Crash was not the major cause of the Great Depression, but it undermined the economy's ability to hold out against other weaknesses. So you can see it wasn't the one thing, it was like what broke everything. In the 1920s, the stock market had inflated stock prices and the purchase were made on a margin. This means buying on the margins, borrowing money from a broker to purchase stock. You can think of this as a loan from your brokerage. Banks are in a tailspin. Banks really struggled during this period for two main reasons. The first reason was due to the fact that many banks had lent money to stock speculators. Secondly, many banks had invested depositors' money into stock market with the hopes of high returns. So the banks were doing the same thing that people were doing, and that was not good. This was concerned because some of the depositors were unaware that the banks were using their money. So then when they went to get their money back after the stock market fell, there was no money to get back. Okay, so next slide. The roots of the Depression, an even distribution of income. In the United States at this time, the top 5% of the population earned 30% of the income. In comparison, about 2/3 of the families earned less than $2,500 a year. With this uneven distribution of income, problems arose. Many people purchased expensive items like refrigerators and in cars on installment plans, which are like credit. Okay, don't do this in your life. This meant that the money was paid back over time with a payment plan. Also, many items were sold in this time period had cutbacks. When sales dropped, so did production. When production dropped, laborers were laid off. This cycle ran through the economy and really damaged it. the loss of export sales. One mistake the U.S. made in the economic downfall was the fact that they did not lend foreign countries any money. It turns this limited export, in turn, this limited exports and sales. The Hawley-Smoot tariff did not help matters. The tariff raised tariff rates on to an all-time high in the country. This made buying and selling with foreign countries very hard. In response to the U.S., many foreign countries raised their rates, thus making the situation worse. Mistakes by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve made numerous mistakes that led to the eventual crash of the economy. First, rates were not raised to accommodate the excessive speculation. This led to banks making risky loans. The second problem was the fact that since rates were not raised, many business leaders assumed that the economy was still expanding. You could think about our own crash that you guys have all survived, the crash of 2008, and how banks were giving risky home mortgages to people with crazy things going on to get home mortgages. And then that crashed because the price of homes went up beyond the actual what the home was worth. So the Depression worsens. Life during the Depression was very hard. During the time span of 29 to 33, many banks closed. Several businesses were closed as well due to the economic downturn. One of the major issues was the fact that the average family income dropped from 2000 in only 3 years. Many people were out of jobs and very few people had money. You guys have lived through a little bit of this with the banks closing and stuff. During your time, we did that in the recession. During the Depression, the lack of income for families meant that a lot of people were starving. In order to try to offset this problem, many charity organizations found ways to feed the poor. Although the food they received was not a large portion, people were able to eat something. Okay, now we go on to the next area, and please look at these pictures because you can see what a Hooverville is and shanty towns, and what ends up happening is that during the Depression, many Americans could not afford their homes and lost them. Once they were evicted by bailiffs, who were court officers that evicted tenants, they would create shanty towns, communities of evicted people, where houses that are made up of scrap, usually out of wood. These towns would be located on public property. People mainly angry at President Hoover conveniently called these little places Hoovervilles. Okay. Now, a lot of people, about 2 million men more than women, became homeless and decided to ride the rails, go on the railroads and go from place to place, and they could be working for a day, and that's it, and get enough money for the next day, and then go to another place and work to get enough money for the next place. So they came up with codes to communicate with each other. And you can see some of those to the left. Each of these things means something. You know, the cat up there means kind lady. The R, if you're sick, they'll take care of you. So once people were evicted, they could move to a shanty town or move around the country, constantly looking for temporary work. People that wandered the United States were called hobos. They would sneak onto railroad cars and go from town to town. They created simple codes to warn others regarding their location. Hundreds of thousands of men did this during the Depression. Groups of hobos in one camp were called hobo jungles. Now, to add insult to injury, and you guys will see a movie about this in your questions, then the dust storm hits. So the dust storms come as a result of the Dust Bowl area. The Midwestern farmers were severely affected by the Dust Bowl. This area was hit with a devastating drought. The drought caused the soil to turn to dust. The wind constantly whipping in the area, several dust storms that took place each year. In 1937, it was said that 72 dust storms took place. With barely any money, most of the farmers packed up their families to head to California for what they thought might be a better life, usually with relatives. When they reached California, many lived in roadside camps, homeless and impoverished. You can see these. So if things weren't crazy enough in this Dust Bowl, this is, just amazing. They lose the population. During this time, people could not farm. This means that they could not earn money, so they had to move. They left South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas for many other states to find food, jobs, and a better way of life from the dust storms. The dust was so bad that it was carried 2,000 miles, some say 1,600 miles. But basically, dust in the center of our country was found in the Atlantic Ocean, on boats, out in sea, So it all blew, as you've seen when you watch the weather, how the jet stream moves. It's not going to move to the Pacific Ocean. That's not the way the wind blows at these higher levels. At these higher levels, the wind blows towards the Atlantic, which is what happened. And then you can see the new population distribution on the Dust Bowl map down below. And you can see the places where people fled to. Now, just to escape their troubles, people would go to the movies. Movies were exceptionally popular at the time. So what they did was Hollywood became this fantasy factory. As many Americans needed a way to escape the real-life problems of the Great Depression, one way they did this was to farm for it was a new form of entertainment. Films were cheap and allowed many to get out and do something. Men like Walt Disney helped bring fantasy to life for a struggling population. And if you look down below, originally these Hollywood Hills were a housing development called Hollywoodland, and now of course we just call it Hollywood, on the air. While movies were an escape for some people, many people also enjoyed the radio. Families would gather around and listen to speeches, comedian stories, tales of heroes, or soap operas. The radio allowed strangers to find common ground with one another and really ease the sense of depression. So you can see Walt Disney down there and just what was going on during that particular time, that form of escapism. Okay, we're on to section 3, which means that we have a lot more data. So prompting recovery, voluntary efforts, and public works. President Hoover was very worried about the economy. In 1931, he called for mayors and governors to push public works. What are these? They are the building programs not done by private sector but by the government. Hoover Dam is one amazing example of this. Programs and spending. However, if enough jobs were to be created, massive government spending would have to happen. Hoover refused to spend mass amounts of money. At the midterm election, which means that it's 2 years after the presidential election, with the economy the way it was, many citizens blamed the party that was in power. That party at the time was the Republican Party. After the midterm election, the Republicans lost 49 seats in the House of Representatives. However, they were able to hold on to the power in the Senate by 1 vote. So trying to rescue the banks. With money at a large shortage, President Hoover asked the Federal Reserve Board to print more money, which makes no sense because just because you have more printed money, it devalues the money. It's just like taking one cinnamon roll. If you divide it by 5 people, great. If you divide it by 20 people, you get smaller amounts. And they refused. Hoover then set up the National Credit Corporation. The idea was for this group to loan banks money so they could deal loans. With that idea not working, Hoover had no other option. The government was going to have to produce funding for borrowers. This allowed for the creation of the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Although the RFC was overly cautious, it failed to increase its loans in significant amounts to meet the need. Thus, the economy continued to decline. And now you guys can start looking at the graphs below. In 1932, the government passed the Emergency Relief and Construction Act. This act allowed the government spending to directly help the citizens. Hoover, who was opposed to this type of federal spending, reluctantly signed the act. However, the new program could not reverse the accelerating collapse. So people got angry and decided to march. And they're called the Hunger Marches. These were large gatherings of starving people. They were angry about being jobless and very hungry. One instance in Washington, D.C., the crowd was met by police and denied food, water, and medical treatment. However, Congress told the police that the crowd had every right to petition their government. They then marched on Capitol Hill. And then once they were on Capitol Hill, here are some examples of other people that went through things during the march. For example, there was the Farmers' Revolt. Similar to hunger marches, these revolts included very angry people. Many farmers were angry because they felt they made a large sacrifice during World War I, producing items to help the cause. However, in World War I, nearly 1 million farmers had their farms foreclosed on. In order to show their anger, farmers prevented the delivery of vegetables. Farmers also blocked highways and stopped milk trucks and emptying milk into the ditches. And then this particular march right here, I say in there that my grandfather did participate in this. They were called the Bonus Marchers. And the Bonus Marchers were people that they were supposed to get a payout in 1931. So after the war, they got paid, and then I guess if they were still alive, they'd get another bonus of money. But they said, you know what? We don't want to wait that long. We need the money now. We're hungry. We need it. So give us our bonus now. So that's why they're called bonus marchers. They were promised $1,000, but it would not give them until 1945. In 1931, Congress said that they could borrow half of that amount. By 1932, the veterans wanted the rest. Veterans started marching in Oregon to D.C. More joined them along the way, and they were called the Bonus Army. In D.C., they camped in Hoovervilles. When their bonus was voted down, many tried to stay in D.C., but the president sent MacArthur after them, and you could see he fired at them, and it killed people, killed a small child. It was crazy. Here you guys can see we had the midterm elections where we said that in the House and the Congress, there was a changeover of 49 places. Now you can see the changeover of the entire nation. So look how red and Republican it was in 1928, but at the Depression it completely changes to Roosevelt. So it's just staggering. Roosevelt promised recovery with a New Deal for the American people. He actually did that in the first 100 days, and it was actually called the first 100 days. It wasn't called the New Deal. Roosevelt won by a landslide in both the electoral and popular vote, receiving the highest percentage of popular vote for a Democratic nominee. In his first 100 days of office, which began on March 4th, 1933, Roosevelt spearheaded major legislation and issued a profusion of executive orders that instituted the New Deal, a variety of programs designed to produce relief, government jobs for the unemployed, recovery, and reform. So what I did is I went on to the next chapter just a little bit, so you can see that we're actually in chapter 23, section 2. We kind of started chapter 23 on the last slide. I just want to make sure you know where we're at. So in that picture above, you could see the first New Deal and what went through. Okay, and then there's going to be a second New Deal on the next slide. One of the interesting things is this March of Dimes reading over here. In 21, Franklin Roosevelt contracted polio, a disease that paralyzed the legs. You get it through fecal matter, poop in your water. It's actually a huge prevalent problem in India today as well, because a lot of people don't exist near clean water. But most of the people got polio in like streams or rivers or lakes where they might swim, where the water wasn't chlorinated. Few people knew of his physical limitation when he became president. His only freedom from braces came when he swam. After Roosevelt established a foundation for polio victims at Warm Springs, Georgia, entertainer Eddie Cantor suggested that everyone in the country send a dime for polio research to the president. This campaign, which became known as the March of Dimes, produced 150,000 letters a day. In 1945, Congress voted to honor Roosevelt by placing an image on the dime. Okay, so the 100 days begins. When Roosevelt entered the office, he wanted to change things. His words were, let's just try something. Between March 9th and June 16th, Roosevelt sent countless bills to Congress. Congress passed 15 major acts to meet the economic crisis. This was originally called the 100 Days, and it would later become known as the New Deal. The origins of the New Deal? Well, FDR was not an intellectual. He did not have a strong political ideology. However, he did like to experiment. So Roosevelt sought advice from many advisors who came from vast backgrounds. Roosevelt's advisors did not, however, always agree, but that is what helped Roosevelt make key decisions. Roosevelt's administrators were divided into three groups. Although these groups did not see eye to eye most of the time, the advisors believed in a form of progressivism. One group had firm beliefs based on Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism, believing that government and business should work together. The second did not trust business and blamed business leaders for the Great Depression. The third group supported New Freedom of Woodrow Wilson. They also blamed large trusts for the Great Depression. This group wanted government to restore competition in economy. You guys can see the second New Deal. The most promising part of that is still in act today is the Social Security Act. You probably hear old people talk about that all the time. How much Social Security do you get? Or it's illegal. They keep cashing the Social Security checks. So what we have here is fixing the banks. The Emergency Banking Relief Act in March of 1933, FDR declared a national bank holiday. Roosevelt then called special sessions to discuss the bank issues. Within 38 minutes, the House of Representatives unanimously passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This allowed citizens to feel safe depositing their money back into the banks. Roosevelt was even quoted saying, "I assure you that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress." Regulating banks and brokers. After restoring the confidence of the banks, FDR's advisors pushed for him to set new regulations on both banks and stock market. Roosevelt agreed with the idea and pushed his support behind the Securities Act of 1933 and the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. Both of these acts allowed people to have the confidence of depositing money or the stock market. Okay, so now let's go down. It did prevent fraud, by the way. Challenges to the New Deal, criticism of the left and right. Roosevelt's politics drew criticism from both the left and the right wing of the political spectrum. People on the right believed that the New Deal imposed too many regulations on business. People on the left believe Roosevelt went far enough, really wanted government to intervene even more dramatically in the economy and shift wealth from the rich to middle class income and poor Americans. Sounds like something that's going on today. Huey Long. He was maybe the biggest threat for the left wing. Long was a Democratic senator from Louisiana. Many believed if Long ran as a third party in 1936 election that he would take at least 10% of the votes from Roosevelt. Father Coughlin, he allowed Huey Long to become more credible. Originally, Coughlin was a follower of the New Deal, but he soon became impatient with its moderate reforms. He wanted a wealthy to be taxed more and for the bank system to be nationalized. The Townsend Plan. The Townsend, a former public health officer, wanted Roosevelt to pay citizens over the age of 60 a pension of $200 a month. The idea was that the entire check had to be spent. This would help the economy. It would also allow for jobs to open up for the unemployed. And then finally launching the second New Deal, and that talks about Social Security. The WIPOL, the Works Progress Administration, was headed by Harry Hopkins. And then, I don't know why I had that L there. That makes no sense. Spent billions of dollars for millions of workers. Those workers constructed about 650,000 miles of highways, roads, streets, and 125,000 public buildings, and more than 8,000 parks. It was like they were going to get the public back to work, even if it was a government job. Okay, so this is very controversial about the Great Depression, and some argue what caused it and some argue what ended it. You can see some things that people feel ended it. War. So the Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. From 1931 to 1940, unemployment was always in double digits. In April of 1939, almost 10 years after the crisis began, more than 1 in 5 Americans still could not find work. On the surface, World War II seems to mark the end of the Great Depression. During the war, more than 12 million Americans were sent into the military, and a similar number toiled in defense-related jobs. Those war jobs seemingly took care of 17 million unemployed in 1939. Most historians have therefore cited the massive spending during wartime as the event that ended the Depression. Now, if you think about this, a lot of people during our own recession signed up for the military. And the military was able to get more strict in who they were actually allowing in the military because they were able to pick who they wanted. If the recipe for economic recovery is putting tens of millions of people in defense plans or military marches, then having them make or drop bombs on our enemies overseas, the value of world peace is called into question. In other words, if the only way we could do to solve the economic crisis was to have a war, that's a terrible thing. That's a terrible way to fix a problem. In truth, building tanks and feeding soldiers, as necessary as it was to winning the war, is also a crushing financial burden. FDR was at war. His New Deals had to be halted for the war, and then he died before the war ended. Harry Truman followed in his footsteps. To pay for these plans, the government used taxes. It taxed the highest earners in America, means the rich. After many years of confiscatory taxes, businessmen desperately needed incentives to expand. By 1945, the top marginal income tax rate was 94% on income over 200,000. We also had high excise profits tax that was absorbed more than 1/3 of all corporate profits. That's amazing. That's taking away so much that they worked to get. In 1943, and other corporate tax reached as high as 40%. Wow. My family lives in Australia, and my sister-in-law tells me that if you earn